Okay, Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift, who built a bigger music empire? So I was wondering who built a bigger music empire, Taylor Swift or Michael Jackson. So I went ahead and looked it up, and one of them's the King of Pop, who just had a movie released about them, and the other is the biggest active music star on the planet. And when you put both of their financial success side by side, the story is much more interesting than a lot of people would expect. So let's go ahead and get started. So how much is each of them worth? So obviously Michael Jackson did pass away quite a few years ago. So we're going to go ahead and use his estate. Now, a lot of analysts put Michael Jackson's estate worth about $2 billion right now. So that's comprised of music rights, licensing, and posthumous projects. But one of the more interesting thing is that Michael Jackson passed away in 2009. And when he passed away, supposedly he was in $500 million worth of debt, $500 million. So that $2 billion net worth for his estate was built after he passed away in 2009. Now, when we look at Taylor Swift, a lot of analysts put her net worth to be about $2 billion. And that actually puts her as the first artist to build the billionaire status purely through her music and live performances. So when we compare these two, they're both basically worth about the same. Michael Jackson's estate is worth about $2 billion, and Taylor Swift is worth approximately $2 billion as well. So the first question is, how did Michael Jackson make all of his money? So Michael Jackson's income came from multiple sources at his peak. A lot of it had to do with some of his most famous albums, which include Thriller, Dangerous, and Bad. Those records generated hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties and sales. He was a true world star. In fact, his tours were always record-breaking events, and he was selling out stadiums not only in the US, but throughout the entire world. So one of his most famous endorsement deals was with the beverage company Pepsi. That was supposedly worth $5 million, which is a huge contract in the 1980s. But certainly one of his smartest financial moves was when he bought the Beatles catalog in 1985. Supposedly he paid $43 million for that catalog. However, when he passed away, his estate supposedly sold half of the rights to that, which amounted to about $600 million. That's a pretty good investment. Now, at his peak in the 1980s, supposedly Michael Jackson was earning between $50 and $100 million per year as one of the highest paid performers in history. Now let's jump over to Taylor Swift. How did she make all of her billions of dollars? So Taylor's path to $2 billion is really quite impressive. She built that net worth basically just off of music alone. No fashion line, no beauty line, no liquor company, just songs, touring, and smart ownership. And the most recent boost to her net worth was her tour, which is named Eras, and it surpassed $2 billion in ticket sales. And that sets a historic milestone as the highest grossing musical tour ever. In fact, that single tour alone earned her more than most artists make in their entire career. One of her smarter business decisions is when her original music masters were sold without her consent. She recorded her first 6 albums as Taylor's version, which allowed her to reclaim the revenue from her music, which brought in enormous streaming revenue and sales revenue. So that move alone turned a business dispute into a financial win. But who's better at managing their money, Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift? So this is where the comparison gets really interesting, and that's because Michael Jackson was documented to be extremely bad at managing his finances, despite earning massive amounts of money through his career. Supposedly his lifestyle alone costed between $50 and $100 million every year. If you remember Neverland Ranch, supposedly that costed millions of dollars a year just to maintain that property. And in fact, at the time of his passing, supposedly he was in debt for $500 million, which took years for his estate to pay that off. Now, if we jump over to Taylor Swift, she was remarkably disciplined with her finances. She owns multiple properties which have increased in value over the years. She's maintained control of her music catalog. She has structured her touring business to maximize profit at every single step of the way. That includes ticket sales to streaming to merchandise. In fact, she's stayed pretty much out of any kind of public financial disasters. There's not really any reports of her recklessly spending. She's avoided having any kind of lawsuits over unpaid debts. So on money management, Taylor Swift definitely wins this comparison. It's not even close. Unfortunately, Michael Jackson was really excellent at generating revenue, but not really great at keeping the money. So which one of these two artists broke more records, Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift? So both of these artists are definitely record breakers in the music industry. However, they are performing in different eras, and the measurement of success when Michael Jackson was around is completely different than Taylor Swift. So we'll look at Michael Jackson's Thriller album. It still remains the best-selling album in music history. It sold 66 million copies. Now, if we look at his music videos, especially Thriller and Beat It, those two videos alone set the standards for music videos in the industry. And Michael Jackson was actually the first person to have a #1 album, a #1 single, and a #1 movie all at the same time. Now, if we look at Taylor Swift, her Taylor's Era tour became the highest grossing tour in concert history. She also became the first artist to have 4 different albums in the top 10 on billboards all at the same time. And if we look at Spotify's records, she is the #1 most streamed female artist of all time. And she's also the fastest musical artist to become a billionaire solely through her music. So as you can see, both of them, Taylor Swift and Michael Jackson, have both set numerous records. However, those records were broken in an era for Michael Jackson when physical record sales were common, and Taylor Swift is breaking records in the streaming era. So which one of these two artists had more control over their music catalog, Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift? So this angle tells 2 completely different stories, because when we look back at Michael Jackson, he spent a lot of his career fighting with record industry executives and his business partners to have control over his creatives and his finances. In fact, he had a very public battle with Sony Music in the 2000s. So he did end up having significant ownership over his catalog. However, that dispute in the public took a toll in his personal and his financial life. Now, when we look at Taylor Swift and the story about her music ownership, that public dispute actually became one of the precedents for controlling your music catalog if you're an artist. So when her masters were sold off without her permission or without her blessing, she didn't just accept the situation. She actually re-recorded the entire backlog to reclaim control. So that decision alone costed a lot of time and energy. However, that allowed her to gain control of her music permanently. So as far as music ownership, I would say that Taylor Swift's story is much more impressive. She was able to gain control of her music catalog in a more complete manner and in a way that the public was really rooting for the small guy in that situation. So aside from that, who had more of a cultural impact, Taylor Swift or Michael Jackson? So I would say that Michael Jackson's cultural impact is impossible to overstate. I would say that he essentially invented modern pop music. He also transformed music videos into an art form, almost like a Hollywood production. Some of his most famous dance moves, like the moonwalk, are recognized globally. Also, he was a performer during a time when Black artists really weren't the norm on MTV. So I would say that he changed fashion, music, dance, and entertainment all at the same time. Now, if we look at Taylor Swift, her cultural impact in her era is really impressive as well. In fact, one of the most impressive things she's done is she's built up a relationship with her fans in the social media age. She's turned every personal experience into music that millions of people can relate with just by listening to it. It almost feels like it was written specifically just for you. Now, when we look at the economic boom just from her Taylor Swift tours, there's a lot of cities that see an impact in their GDP just by accepting her tours. So as you can see, both of these artists have changed culture in their era. But for me, Michael's was much more visually revolutionary. However, with Taylor Swift, it's much more economic and emotional. So what does the financial story of these two tell about the music industry? So this is actually one of the more interesting questions of this comparison. So Michael Jackson made most of his money through touring and through music before the streaming era. So his Thriller album, for example, sold 66 million copies. And this is a time when people were paying for physical CDs of his music. Now, if we look at Taylor Swift, she is in the streaming era where a stream is going to be paying a fraction of a cent each time somebody listens to the song. And the fact that she became a billionaire in the streaming era where you're only getting paid a fraction of a cent, that's really impressive. And that's because the business model that she's operating in is much less favorable to the artist compared to the Michael Jackson era. So basically, Taylor Swift figured out how to become a billionaire when music is almost free to the public. So is there anything that Michael Jackson clearly beats Taylor Swift? I would say yes. I want to be fair here to Michael Jackson because Michael Jackson's artistic innovation was on a completely different level than anything that we've seen since he passed away, including with Taylor Swift. He didn't just make pop music, he actually reinvented what pop music could look like, sound like, feel like multiple times over his career. So when we look at his records, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, those aren't just successful albums, they are artistic landmarks that completely change the direction of music. Also, Michael Jackson achieves his success at a time when there was no social media, no streaming, no algorithm to push the artist into the public's eye. Everything was built through sheer talent, performance, and word of mouth. So that brings me to my last question. Who built a larger musical empire, Taylor Swift or Michael Jackson? So based off of all of the public records I've been able to find, it's actually really close. Both of their financial empires are basically on par at about $2 billion net worth. However, as we've talked about, the paths they took to get there are completely different. Michael Jackson earned hundreds of millions of dollars, but he spent even more than that, passed away in debt, and left behind an estate that was built up to $2 billion after he passed away. Now we look at Taylor Swift, she's built up her empire to basically the same, around $2 billion based on analyst best estimates, but she did it while she's still alive. And then also the majority of that money came from her music alone in a time when streaming makes it really difficult for artists to make that kind of money. She also owns much more of her empire than Michael ever did when he was alive. So on pure financial management and ownership, Taylor Swift definitely wins. However, on artistic innovation and cultural disruption, Michael Jackson would win. So as you can see, both of these artists have done something genuinely historic with their careers. So when I started this, I was really surprised to find out that Taylor Swift and Michael Jackson's estate is basically worth about the same. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully you found that interesting, and I'll see you on the next one.